Yay!
It was better.
We did it. I
I
know.
actually remembered this time.
I know. At least we hit the go live button on time the first time. So welcome to Atomics on a Friday, where we are the El Camino of security testing. I guess before we get truly started, I actually made an announcements list of things to announce. And it's very short. So first is this week we have a special guest, which we'll showcase in a moment. Next week, Anton joins us, and be sure to like and subscribe so that you do get notified. And eventually we'll figure out an ICS file to share because, it's hard. And then our next, when this video is saved, any files that we produce, anything like that, we'll put up on the GitHub repo, which the link's at the end of the video, or on our pages. And then the last thing that I got is our Offenso Security Tool charity event that we plan to do next month, which I think is April. Yeah.
Allegedly.
That's all the announcements I got for right now. So
we'll recover them at the end. Maybe. If we remember.
Maybe if somebody remembers. All right.
We'll get there.
We got a lot to go over today.
Yeah, we do. Let's do this.
Yep. Okay. I think the agenda, honestly, is just this is CTI Friday. And really we have our good friend here. I'll add you in here, Harrison. Thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're stoked. And do we want to do quick intros again, Paul? Or are we good? We can, probably
I'm Paul,
should.
In case people forget.
Mike. I'm Harrison. If in case you didn't catch last week, and since I won't be on every week like Mike and Paul will, so I'm Harrison. I've been in the CTI realm for about the last 8 years or so, and just doing like general security stuff. So I've been a researcher, I've been an analyst, been doing all kinds of shenanigans. Excited to be here and chat with y'all about stuff.
Yes,
that's awesome.
Well, again, thanks for joining us. Let's kind of quickly, I guess, jump in and recap what we're even doing here today in our March Madness Purple series. The idea we had was to kind of cover a scope of how we can take a threat report and go from just reading it to making it actionable and figuring out, am I protected or do I have the right data sources to detect a threat within my environment? And kind of look at a simplistic approach to make it easy and approachable so that you can do this pretty much with any threat report and kind of validate that you have the right things in place to secure your organization. So Harrison, having a solid CTI background, is going to kind of walk us through today. We're going to start with a Mandiant report that came out the end of January on Gootloader. And again, as we touched on last time, we picked this before Gootloader started taking off and everybody published a report on it. So I want this to be crystal clear, like we were first to think about it, but not on executing of it. So we're not bandwagoning here, even though it may look like it, but that's okay. And then to Mike's point, we'll go into purple teaming next week and then detection and data sources the following week. So kind of what we're going to look at from each approach, starting with CTI today. Going to use that to take the report. Harris is going to walk us through like how we can understand and start pulling out TTPs and mapping them using some cool tools, as well as just some very basic approach of like what we look for. So really excited to dive in today. Anything I missed? Anything I forgot?
There's one thing that I wanted to bring up that we actually skipped over from last week, and since I feel like this is a good day to talk about it, I want to go around and say what everybody's favorite technique or like tactic was, since we didn't do that last week.
Oh yeah,
that is true. Let me go.
I'll start. I'll start since I'm putting y'all on the spot. I'll start. So I actually have like a little bit of a sheet answer. So I don't really have like a favorite technique. I think like my favorite like tactic or tactics are like within the like reconnaissance and like resource development section, which I think doesn't get a whole lot of love. I mean, they're also like the newest to enterprise. They've been a part of like pre-attack, obviously, for a while now. But yeah, they were 2 additions to enterprise, and I just think that they're a very like underutilized, sort of like under-researched area. I think, obviously they're what takes place kind of before it occurs on a box, so, or like within your own environment. So like I can understand why it's under researched and like under studied, I guess. But I think that like it's an area of like a lot of opportunity. Like you see like companies like just throwing names out like abnormal security, or like people who are like tracking like disinformation, or even like like phishing campaigns and stuff like that. Like if you can like really understand what's happening at the very beginning, you have a good chance of like stopping it from even getting into any of those other techniques that are a part of the rest of the enterprise. So yeah, I just thought it'd be a fun fun thing to kick today off.
No, it's caught off guard. I totally was not planned for that one, but I definitely do have one. But yeah, I think reconnaissance is an interesting one, and there's definitely different approaches that each org can take, especially with like threat modeling and risk with it. That makes it challenging sometimes that there's no like, hey, buy EDR, it monitors your endpoint, like regardless of what endpoint it is, right? Like how do you then take like some solution? I think one of the things I like most is like domain and typo squatting, domain impersonation, social media impersonation, things of that nature. There's some really cool companies that are doing some really interesting things on that approach as part of kind of within that reconnaissance phase. But technique-wise, so tactic-wise, lateral movement is probably the one thing I've really focused on lately. But specifically, I would say like technique-wise is what is it? Remote services, SMB Windows admin shares, T1021.002. The reason being is that's probably one of the most common things that I've seen from a lateral movement standpoint. Now, implementation execution-wise, like how you're doing it is variance, but if you take that piece away, you force adversaries to have to adapt and move to a different technique, which means you limit their capability going from one endpoint to the other. And if you can do that, you buy time and capability and ability to detect and or prevent and remediate. But I think like a lot of SMB and Windows admin shares are very underutilized. What's up, Chuck? As far as like actually limiting the usage and scoping it down to like what's actually needed, right? The least privilege concept. And I think if orgs focus on that, they start reducing a lot of attack risk and surface by focusing on things like lateral movement, because then you go back to, okay, it's single endpoint. From there, what then could I do? And I think that kind of creates a different type of dynamic versus trying to focus on 7 different tactics and like 80 different techniques leading up to lateral movement potentially. Like you kind of like start there and then go back to focusing on like the single endpoint instances. Just kind of an abstract way that I think about it, of like prevent the movement or limit it, and then I can focus back on the other things and kind of start to figure out where I go from there from a detection, prevention, mitigation standpoint.
Yeah, for sure.
I think my favorite technique, I had to pull all kinds of stuff up because it's actually kind of cool, is I don't know, I think my favorite might be scheduled task. T1053.005, mainly because at a prior org, we got wrecked by a scheduled task using the task service Win32 like API stuff. And no EDR saw it, and it just kind of like went in and scheduled the task, and it just showed up, right? Mm-hmm. And so I actually have it's I'll post the link into the chat because it's kind of a neat script to run. But if you use the task service, new task stuff, this is just the VB version of it, and it'll go through and create it. And so when I started reinvestigating it later here at Splunk, it took me down some dark roads because I was like, if a task gets created and you don't see it from like an EDR perspective, it's not scheduled tasks anymore. It's not AT anymore. It's just there. So how do you go and detect or identify a task being added? So I have, tons of different Windows event logs out there that I've got to learn about and play with and understand. And then Some adversaries will update a task, so there's a new event for that, things like that. So I really dig Task Edge.
It's interesting you say that. So like when you, not to turn into the host here, but so
the tables have turned.
So like when you so when that happens, right? So like scheduled task is set on the box. Are you basically limited then to only being able to see when it fires and then being able to remediate like once that happens? Like if it's there, are you kind of just like SOL until something actually happens?
I mean, I guess, right? Because that's what happened to us. Is it was scheduled, it ran, and then this random file, loaded up basically. So we didn't know about it. We didn't catch the file right or running or anything like that either. So it was completely one off. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess that's kind of like I guess I don't want to call it like a gap for EDR, because EDR is not there to collect Windows event logs, but you could use something like OS Query to gather all those tasks. As you get into a fleet, you inventory like what are these for and whatever. Or if you're doing incident response, you would gather tasks across the fleet too to know what's out there. Or at least when you're investigating a box, you would check them hopefully.
But like XDR should solve that, because it should be aggregating from various data sources. Now, in some EDR's defense, they do collect specific event types for things like scheduled task creation. So they do something like
the ETW stuff is coming in right now, which is great. Like there's definitely some notification from that perspective. But yeah.
To your point, though, a lot of it's blind because you're not pulling in some of those. You're relying purely on like the process metadata, like the telemetry aspect of like process start, process stop, things that occurred from there. So if you're only looking and collecting things like scheduled task.exe, there's a blind spot. But if you do something like API calls to register it, then yeah, it's absolutely blind.
Right.
But in some cases, some EDRs are actually now, to your point, pulling in those ETW providers, like consuming from those providers to actually create like scheduled tasks was registered type of activity.
Yeah. And like, it's interesting because like, again, coming from like a CTI background, right? Like obviously y'all are way more, knowledgeable in the detection and like threat hunting areas. And like CTI has always been my jam. So like, even before even going to like Red Canary, like I didn't really have a whole lot of exposure to like detection engineering and like how that actually plays out like in practice, right? So it's interesting to see how that all kind of like comes together. And I think like that's a really good, just kind of bringing it back to like why we're here, right? That like I think that's why it's good to have these different like perspectives, right? Because it's like if you just took somebody who had been only in CTI or only kind of non-practitioner, kind of in the technical sort of like weeds, like detection engineering or something like that, and you give them something like simple, like a scheduled task, right? Like you think that that's simple, right? Like, oh, obviously you should be able to detect that. But then Mike, you bring up the point of like, well, it's already got set, right? So like what happens when you put your sensor on a box after it's already been set? Like what if the EDR doesn't collect that ETW or doesn't collect those sources, right? So like that's just stuff that you don't think about because I don't know. It's just a totally different mindset in terms of like the different sections of security that all need to work together, right? So
I think it comes down to like now, okay, how do I then determine, which is why we're here today, like how do I determine based on reading these reports, like what should I go focus on? Like what is the important things that I should test and what are the things that are like, yeah, that's cool, I'm going to set it to the side, but it's not a priority this second, right? Like I can't necessarily maybe action it like today, but there may be other things that like I can go do a test, I can go validate data source, I can go do something like now to do it versus some of that. So I think it's like I'm really excited to see like how you approach this and your perspective of like when you start ripping apart, because I think a lot of times some people just go straight to the bottom and go, here are the techniques listed, but that doesn't really give you a starting point. Like you go look at something like scheduled task create or service create, like how many different ways can you actually effectively do that?
Yeah.
But then it's like, okay, let me go look at the procedural things of like, how are they doing it? And then can I see at that procedural way, can I do it? Obviously that makes it difficult to scale when there's 50 ways, but at least it's a starting point to at least start to gauge where I'm at within my particular org scenario to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
But again, please don't sue us if whoever this image is. There was no Gootloader image, so I just took Bouquet. I put loader over it. We don't make any money on these.
Where's my fat goose? Oh, there he is. Okay.
There
There he
it
is. Yeah, he lives on.
But we'll drop it in chat so that everybody can follow along. So again, we are here talking on Gootloader today. Specifically, we're going to focus on the Mandiant report. The things that we do, hopefully over the next 3 weeks, are kind of methodologies or approaches you can take on any report, right? Like the idea is that we're just starting with this one as like a starting point and figuring out like, okay, the walk, crawl, run idea of like, let's start basic and then build off of it. But really excited to see where we go from this. So follow along, and I think we're ready to dive in. So, Harrison, you want to share your screen, or we can share our screen and you just tell us what to do? But
yeah, I mean, if y'all want to share that Google Doc that I sent, I mean, I'll kind of just talk over it. I just had like some notes written down, and then I figured we can just like jive about kind of what I was thinking about. Yeah, so I think like.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, I can do it.
Were you doing it? Okay,
cool.
You were doing it. Sorry.
All good. So yeah, so I mean, like, I guess like just to kick it off, right? I think what you just said is exactly accurate. Of like, if you just pulled up this Mandiant report and then you tried to scroll down to the bottom and was like, all right, I just want to know like what techniques are in here, right? Like I want to know. Like I just want to know what techniques there are. Number one, you won't be able to find that, unfortunately, in this report because they don't have like a table at the bottom. And I just didn't include like the technical indicators in here, which is just like that whole. It's like a section of like Yara and all that. So if you want all that, then definitely just go directly to the blog. But so that's kind of like one sort of gap, right? So like when you pop up in this blog, you're like, all right, well. They haven't listed out anything, so now I have to go ahead and figure this out. So I think the way that I see kind of approaching a blog like this, or really any kind of like mapping exercise, right, is when you're starting, you want to, and this is going to sound so cliche to like so many people, but it's fine because it works. You're going to want to define your scope like at the outset. So like if you are like, let's say that you're working on an exercise, the purple team exercise, right? And you are, let's say the purple team only wants to focus on, let's say defense evasion techniques or initial access techniques or whatever that is. It's not going to do you as the analyst, as the mapper, that much good to go through this entire report and be like, all right, I want to pull out every single technique, because I mean it's you only have the limited amount of time, right? So like you want to be focusing on like the things that are most important. So I think for one, defining your scope up front of what you're doing, whether it is just one blog or even like multiple blogs, right? Like let's say like you just showed that screenshot of all those different Gootloader headlines, and like obviously there's going to be a ton of blogs about Gootloader. Defining that scope up front when you have that sort of like sort of overwhelming amount of information is going to be super important because again, you're going to be on a time frame, you're going to be on time limited in some sense. So yeah, so that's I think the first step. I think for this exercise, I'll just kind of approach it from like, we want to know everything that's in this blog, which is a fine thing to do. It's just kind of like depends on what it is that you're trying to do. So I think where I would start is, which is actually nice in Google Docs. So a little trick of the trade here I'll share. If you're on like a blog or something like that, switch it over to the reader view, which is like it gets rid of like all the ads and everything. So yeah, if you do this and you don't have it on. So it's weird. So in Chrome, sometimes you have to like turn it on in like the dev tools or something. But basically if there is I think you have to set like an actual flag in Chrome, which is really dumb. Here, if I can share, I'll show it. I'll show you.
Yeah, you share.
Okay.
It's probably better this way.
Let's see. All right. So, all right, can you see that? Oh, you probably can't see the little icon.
We just added it there. Oh yeah. I can't see the toolbar piece, but
yeah, that's all right. Well, basically, like you can look it up. There's a way to turn it on in Chrome. In I think in Firefox, it's like already enabled, but whatever. Anyways, if you hit the button, it obviously will turn it into something that is a lot more readable, right? And like just easier to process whether or not you want to copy it out or whatever. And that's basically what I did to put it into that Google Doc. So just something to start off with that I always do because it's just easier formatting wise and whatnot. So you do that, and then once you pop it into the Google Docs, the Google Doc actually gives you a nice little outline on the left. So like that, and the reason that this is all prefaced to saying this is you want to look through, number one, what all is included in the report at the onset, right? So this outline is super helpful because you're like, all right, number one, are they going to talk about everything that it is that I want to actually study, right? Like if I'm looking for, how just random example, how ransomware is encrypting on a box. Well, this is probably not the blog for that, right? Because it doesn't look like from the outline, there's really going to be anything included in there. So I think that's just a really good place to start, is just to skim through the blog. I would highly recommend not just jumping into a blog and just automatically start like tearing through because as humans, I think it's just hard to like get a lot of the context sometimes. So like, I think it's good to just like sit with the blog, like read it, or what blog, paper, tweet, whatever it is. Just kind of like understand the context that it was written in and do all that. So once you do that, and then once you're actually diving in and you've determined that like, yeah, this is a good thing that I'm going to spend my time doing. So honestly, it's fairly straightforward. The way that I've done it, I mean, that's all I can really say or give, sort of like recommendations about, is what I typically do is I will go through literally sentence by sentence and try and understand, do I think that this is a malicious behavior that is covered underneath the MITRE ATT&CK enterprise framework? Like that is the main question that I've got just from at the very beginning, right? So like if you look at let's say go down to the infection chain. So like this is going to be like your meat of the blog, really. That's why it's like the second section. So like right off the bat, you can see that like you've got user visits, UNC 2565, compromised site, and downloads a malicious zip archive. So in my mind, I'm like, all right, that sounds like a drive-by compromise, right? So I'm like, just to confirm that, typically what I have open in addition to this, like a copied Google Doc or just something that I can mark up a document in, I'll have the attack framework up just in like a separate window. So typically what I'll do then is just like pop over to attack. And then if I think it's drive-by compromise, I'll go directly, to the technique that I think it might be. Or if I don't know, one of the things that is kind of like, I don't know if it's recommend or it's, it's what I think everybody does is just start like typing in like keywords like that you might see in the actual sentence. And then pop it into attack, the little search bar, and then see what comes back, right? Like look at like unique stuff like compromised site or, download or a malicious zip archive or, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
And just see what kind of comes up.
So you kind of go, I mean, thankfully this blog is broken down like this, but you would more or less kind of go through and maybe like tag technique IDs on each and then kind of travel down the list. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I think I really don't see this a lot, which I really wish we did.
That's clean.
Well, number one, that it's that clean, but number two, that techniques, if a technique does get mapped in a report or whatever, that it gets actually put with the context, right? That it gets put with the sentence. Because a lot of times, like what we were saying earlier, if it just gets put at the very bottom, you don't get a lot of the context for what that actually means or like what it is, right? So like, also it doesn't typically, what I've seen is that if it's at the bottom of a report, they'll have paraphrased some stuff like in the actual, like, so you have technique ID, technique name, and then procedure or the sentence, whatever that's representing that technique. And it just loses a lot of that, like, really good, like, context that you might want. Also, what is happening around it, right? Like, again, in a blog like this, it's super nice because it is like an infection chain. It has like literally steps. That's, I mean, like, y'all tell me, like, from a detection engineering and like threat hunter perspective, like, I think that that's super useful to understand how things lead to each other, right? Because it's like, that's what you're looking for, right?
Yep. And yeah, I'm digging this because I am the smash and grab person when it comes to blogs. I don't read every word for word. So this is slowing me down, but I'm grateful that there is like a little breakdown here, because normally I'm just like, all right, show me the reg mod, like show me where it's at, like what happened when, and okay, I get it. Can I write an atomic? Okay, cool. And or what does this look like in the JS? What's it look like in the script, right? Like, okay, how is it doing that? That's where I'm at. Smash and grab.
Harrison, I think we kind of think in the same way as like when I read and want to understand the flow, the attack path that happened, I want to know the techniques that occurred in that particular order, like what fed and like where are they like combined. Because I think a lot of times you look at the framework and it's kind of just read it left to right. Like I want to focus here, but it doesn't mean just because they're listed in that order means that that's how the attack actually happens. And there's 100%. A lot of back and forth. And right, you think about lateral movement. Well, once you hit lateral movement, you pretty much go back to something like reconnaissance, which is a lot of like net commands, like who am I, like where am I type of stuff. And then it kind of feeds back in. But like, I think doing it that way is a better idea, because what you could then do is over time stack. Yeah, just go smash and grab, find the good stuff, get in, get out. Like, there's nothing wrong with that approach either. But like, if you can map over time the paths that different adversaries take, or even the same one over time where they change, you can then start to say, like, probability wise, like, okay, if I know nodes A, B, and C occur in this attack path, I can have some probability of the next 3 potential things that occur, whether it's the same threat group or variances, right? If I can do some like statistical analysis on that, versus again to the point of just, here's all the techniques, good luck. And then you say, well, I got scheduled task covered for persistence, I'm golden. But again, how many ways can you create a scheduled task, and are you actually golden? So I think it's kind of an interesting perspective.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, I think that this blog specifically, not to give, Mandiant props, obviously this is a great blog, but like, it's very well laid out, right? This is not, I would say this is not the norm. I think in a lot of times you see a lot of blogs that are not this clear with how an infection chain or how an execution of a malware or whatever, kind of like takes place. I think that's one thing that's sort of lacking in just the industry abroad, like, not abroad, like overseas, but like, everyone in the industry could beef that up a little bit. But anyways.
Now, Harrison, the important question here is, how many times have you had to type out an MD5 hash or a SHA-256 from a screen capture?
That always kills me too, because it's like, I mean, even not just that, even like registry keys, right? Like that get screenshotted, and I'm like, you didn't type it out. Like, I need it. You know what I mean? Like, I know that is going to need to be in whatever thing that I'm producing after I read this. So yeah, that's my not subtle plea to always type out any indicators. So let's see what next. So yeah, I mean, like that, I say at a very basic level, that is kind of my process for like going through this. And I know that sounds very basic, but it is. I mean, it's very, it can be time consuming, but I've found that, I was formerly at MITRE, and I mean doing this for the attack team, and so like I found that taking the time to like go through literally each sentence produces the best like quality mappings, right? And you're not, I think you're not, you're less likely to miss something. Whereas, like if you, so like, let's just say you took, again, even just that first sentence, right? User visits compromised site and then downloads a malicious zip archive. Really, there's multiple techniques there. It's not just one. And like it kind of depends on how you want to break it down. If you just wanted to stop at drive-by compromise, that'd be good. You could also say that like the malicious zip archive, I mean, technically that could be like obfuscated files and information, right? Because like the zip archive. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say also how they got to it, right? Was it like through a phishing link or whatnot? There's
exactly
link IDs for that too. And
Yep. So like I think if you really take the time to like sift through it, and I know that is time consuming for sure. But like I think that's why like CTI analysts have jobs a lot of times, because like I mean I'm just like I literally my 8 years that I've been doing this. One of the core things, and I've said this multiple times, one of the core things that I've always done is mapped MITRE attack techniques. And I mean, I joined the industry when it was starting to really pick up steam. And that, I mean, it's just a kind of a core concept, I think, that a lot of CTI analysts should really have. One thing before I forget, I just wanted to plug there's some like training that MITRE attack puts out. So it's on the website, it's for free. I think Adam Pennington and Katie Nichols put it together. So definitely check that out. In addition to that, there's a CISA best practice guide that I think just got updated not that long ago. So check that out as well. So I think those are like the two really good like resources, like free, totally free, like available, that I would definitely recommend. So yeah,
sweet.
I'll try to find those after this and then send y'all links to send out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so let's see, going through it, I think always as well, this is funny. This is, so like, I just have this like list of like what y'all had put of like understanding TTPs, mapping, things to look for, pitfalls to avoid. I think a thing to look for and a pitfall to avoid is look for the images and avoid not looking at them, because a lot of times there will be additional information in there that is not included in the text. Whether it's a registry key, like we keep saying, or if it's just some sort of step that like, again, gives that additional little nugget of context. It really helps. So like I always spend time on images, and like we were just saying, like if there's a reg key that wasn't typed out in the indicator section or whatever, it could be there, and like that could be a key to like finding something in your environment. So
yeah,
I think while it may seem tedious, it's important because each piece of information is an opportunity from a detection and prevention standpoint, right? So the more opportunities we have to try and pull all those pieces out, the better we are. And it makes it harder for red teams, pen tests, and of course the adversary to actually achieve whatever they're trying to do. So because every action they do results in something that should allow us to detect or prevent or mitigate that thing. So that's a good call out about the images and like reading for those additional pieces that may not be in text somewhere else.
Exactly. So let's see. So I'm just scrolling through the blog here. So got the infection chain. So kind of understand how that mapping takes place. That I really like that y'all picked this blog. This is a really good example blog. So if you scroll down to like the evolution of Gootloader obfuscation section, so I think this is where having the context of what all happens in a blog or in a report is really important. Because if you're reading this sequentially, right? If you're just reading through this blog, you might think that this is like the obfuscation section is I don't know, part of the infection chain maybe, or even like part of the execution chain, or like you might just misunderstand like what this section really is. So like understanding that this section is mainly focused on describing the obfuscation technique's evolution over time, right? Like maybe it's not the most recent stuff, but it is kind of like a study of like this section could be a blog on its own, right? Like you might see this totally split out to be something completely separate. And I've seen tons of blogs that are like just about a specific section of a single piece of malware execution, right? So I think having that context again is like super key, and being able to understand that, like, all right, let's say I'll just pulling an example out. Let's say I'm in an org that got popped by Gootloader, right? And I'm like really wanting to understand what exactly happened, because I think that we were pretty well protected against it. We have a good security team and blah blah blah. This might be a really good section to focus on. Again, if you're doing purple team, atomics, whatever, this might be a good section to focus on, because maybe there's something in here that you don't detect. Or maybe it's something that you just like hadn't thought of or hadn't heard about from Gootloader before. I think, and this is sort of a side tangent, but I think one of the other really, really important things to think about, especially with evolving malware and evolving threat actors and whatnot, not every behavior is going to be covered by attack. So even just reducing everything down to technique IDs, like, is extremely helpful. Don't get me wrong, but understand that not everything is going to be included in there. I mean, there's going to be criminals are always developing new ways to like come up with something new. So like it's a kind of a cat and mouse game, but it always has been. But I think that that's like something to keep in mind as you're going through this. It's like, okay, maybe, so I'm just reading the sentence here. So Gootloader embedded within Trojan Eyes, jQuery libraries, maybe I don't find that within the attack, database, or like, and I'm searching through it and I just like, what could this be? How do I map this, right? Let's just say it's not there at all. That'd be something to talk about. I think that's something to like identify and then bring up with your purple team or bring up with your detection engineers, and just have like specific call out for it, because you're not going to have a table, like it's not going to be within a table of techniques because there's no technique to map it to. So I think that's something to really like bring attention to. And it's an interesting nugget, right? It's like, all right, these days EDRs have all their like alerting and stuff typically mapped to some attack technique. And this wouldn't be included in that, or maybe it's included in the wrong, or in a underneath a technique that it doesn't belong in just because they had to do something. You know what I mean? So like, yeah. I just think it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, the thing I'm kind of getting out of these is there's like 3 variants that they had found over time, and they were embedding their code into these like jQuery libraries, or this one down here, using the jit.js file rather than jQuery. And so, yeah, I think I think it's kind of neat, because like if you were, for like my perspective, I'm like, yeah, I just want to grab the hash. I want to go look at it, and look at the script code itself and see what other interesting nuggets are in there. Because I think from like what you were just saying, it could be used on that purple team engagement to emulate this particular behavior too. Put a different piece of shell code in there or something, or whatever this is, and go from there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think, yeah, that is kind of one thing that I haven't really been mentioning too much, is like those hashes typically are, let's say they're on VirusTotal or wherever they are. You can pull them down, like you say, inspect them, Like I probably wouldn't be doing that because again, I'm just the CTI analyst. So like,
where's the Bobs?
So it's just a whole different mindset, right? Like I just I'll go back to my most recent experience at Red Canary, right? Like we were coupled with malware reversers, right? So like Tony Lambert and Christina Johnson. So like if there was something that I wanted to analyze and really understand, obviously I would pass it off to them, right? I think like, and I realize this is a little bit of a tangent off of this task specifically, but I think a lot of times having sort of like clearly defined roles in a purple team exercise or in CTI mapping exercises or whatever is really important because it allows people to really focus on the things that they, number one, either want to focus on, or number two, are good at focusing on, right? So like, I know that I probably could figure out some malware reversing stuff and like deobfuscation and stuff like that. But I also know that like Tony, for example, is going to be like amazing at that. So like, I'm just going to hand that off to him and he's going to want to dig into that and like really, really tear that apart. I will continue focusing on the techniques. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think a question I have on that then, as far as like orgs that do have separation of like duties, like if you're looking at this and you're like, I'm going to go give this to Tony, but you give everything to Tony or to this, to another person in that role. Like, how do you prioritize like what's most important for someone to go and reverse?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that. I think
fine.
Like, yeah, I think like
I wouldn't want to abuse that person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think everybody.
Maybe Tony. He's probably watching, so everybody send your samples to Tony. He likes OneNote samples in particular.
Exactly. Yeah. Tony, we love you.
Yeah.
So I think from this perspective, right? So let's just take this kind of Gootloader blog. I think if there were like specific things that I was interested in, or that the team was interested in as a purple team exercise, let's say that it is the obfuscation or whatever the jQuery libraries or anything like that. If there's a sample that's specifically tied to that, and we're like, hey, we want to figure out a way that we can test this, that's what I would pass over. If there's like stuff from like 2020 or like years old. And this is in a section obviously about the evolution, so it's going to be tracking kind of over time everything, but find the most recent stuff, right? Like they're always going to be changing, they're always going to be switching stuff up. So I'd say if you have to make a choice, exactly like this, so you have 3 variants here, so which one do you choose? Well, I mean, logically, I would say focus on the most recent one. I mean, why go back to 2021, spend, let's just say a week, like reversing it, and like then you have to do October 2021 and then you do November 2022. Like focus on the most recent stuff, obviously. So I think that's one way to do it. Obviously there's 100 different ways that you could prioritize. If it's, again, like maybe there's a specific technique within one variant that you're like, yeah, I've been seeing that somewhere else, but they describe it really well here in this sample, right? So like maybe this is a good sample to like base future detections on. That could be something useful. I think this will be throughout any sort of recommendations that I give. Communication is going to be key, like among the teams, among the various, whether it's within your Intel team, whether it's within various aspects of your Intel team, like Intel malware analysis, or even across departments, right? So like Intel security research, detection engineering, having clear lines of communication is like super helpful, and super, it just makes things easier, right? Because it's like, hey, I know that I can go ping Mike, or I can go ping Paul and like understand what it is maybe in this one section that would be really useful to know, right? And then I can go do my work and then like dig into it. So yeah.
Nice.
So I guess let's kind of look at an example as part of like stepping through. So if we scroll up to like the initial chain, let's take a look at like a couple of the steps and see like, okay, is this the thing I should focus on, or is there like something else? Because sure, could I detect a file write of a zip file in the user's download folder? Probably. Should I have some detection that says anytime a file is written to the user's download folder, fire an alert? Probably not, right? Like, so it might be a good idea. And well, that may be important to test, right? Like, do I actually have file logging for folders so that I can, in an investigation, I get something else triggered. I got to go back and determine source. Like, yes, I potentially want to do that. But if I'm effectively testing, is that something I may want to do first? Or are there other parts that would be a little bit more interesting or priority on my list to potentially go do? Like, stepping through here, like, let's go like number 3 now. So that one's what? Zip file opens, click JS, blah, blah, recently observed. Okay, so basically the next thing would be user opens the zip folder, executes the JavaScript inside. Well, then what happens after that? Then we can kind of start to break those down. So like, that's kind of a lot right there. So like, how do I then take that and map that to potentially TTPs, which we can then go look at from an atomic standpoint? What's the most relevant procedural or even similar technique-wise things that I could do to kind of emulate or validate that activity? It's like, how do I interpret this?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to like my basic sort of like recommendation of like just breaking it down literally as much as you can, right? So like you say, this number 3 has kind of a lot of stuff going on within it, and it for good reason, right? Because there's a lot of execution that's happening right here. I think so. Like if we just broke it down, so like you've got user opens the zip file, right? So right there, you've got a user. You could map it to what is it, like 1204.001 or 2, which is the user execution for opening a malicious file. That'd be a mapping right there, right? That's kind of an obvious one. I mean, obviously, like user opens zip file, clicks the JS file inside. So the obfuscated JavaScript file, again, if you went into the attack framework and just typed in obfuscate, right, and then clicked into obfuscated files and information, or any of those other techniques, what I would recommend doing, I guess that's one way we can kind of pivot into that. Let's say that you take that one sentence out. You're looking for the obfuscation stuff, and you're like, hey, I think this is in attack. Let me go in there and take a look. So I pop in there, type it in. Let's say I think I identified a potential technique that this could be. So go to the actual technique, read through the description, and like, does what's being described here match what's happening in this execution in the blog? Or is it at least close, right? Like, is it something? And then, yeah, actually, that's a good shout. The sub techniques, right? Maybe there's going to be a specific sub technique for whatever this execution is taking place. Not all the time, because again, like I say, not everything is going to be covered, but it'll at least get you closer and closer. The other good thing that you can do, because most, I'd say like 90% of the techniques have those procedural examples. You can look through those and again see if it's matching kind of like what your blog that you're analyzing is saying. But you can also go, since MITRE has the references in the attack thing, you can actually go to those other blogs and like look and see and understand, like, is this the same thing? Because again, as humans, we're all prone to error, like, and that's fine. So like, let's like pop into one of them and like, let's say you saw a procedural example that matched really, really closely to something that was happening, like this JavaScript execution, right? And you're like, all right, I think I've got it. I think that is my attack technique that I want to map to this, blah, blah, blah. Well, let me just like confirm that, right? So like, let me go pop into the reference blog, like that was used on the procedure. And let me see like what was being discussed there. I mean, obviously 9 times out of 10, the great people at MITRE ATT&CK are going to get it right. But there's always a chance that it could be a little bit off, or maybe it's just a different sub technique, or maybe something's been updated, right? Like things change all the time. So like that'd be something to like dig into to see like, is this what I think it is? So yeah, I'm just kind of going through that number 3 still. Ultimately execute Gootloader PowerShell. So now you've got JavaScript executing, then you've got Gootloader PowerShell. Okay, you've got a whole other sort of like execution chain from like a detection perspective that's happening there, right? So you've got PowerShell that starts up, you've got anything that's happening in that PowerShell script or whatever it is, and then any off processes that are going to be spawning off of that. So like you have like multiple chains, and I think that's kind of why I'm harping on the really focusing on like sentence by sentence, because you've got so much happening in that one step that even though there are 10 steps here or 9 steps or however many there are, there's just so much that can happen within one sentence that from a technique perspective, that it's really important to like really break that down and like, all right, what is happening here? Like, yes, you've said that user executes XYZ and XYZ opens and blah, blah, blah. But like from a technique perspective, if you're going to try and map that down to detection and map that down to execution chain, right? Of like, all right, how do I actually view this in an environment? What does that look like? And like, what are those behaviors that people should be looking for? I think that's pretty key. I see that you've been going through and popping those out. This is also, this is a really good example of what I personally would do, is breaking things out like this. I would also, especially if you're like collaborating with other analysts, I typically will highlight and then make like a comment on something. And usually that's how I do the mappings as well. So like where you have it in line up at number 3, like I typically will just like highlight it and then just have a comment on it. That way it facilitates discussion between, if you are collaborating, it facilitates discussion between the different between different analysts, right? So like, or even different teams, right? So it's like, again, having that communication line, and
you could assign it to Tony.
Exactly. Like 99% of my tasks were just assigned to Tony. So, so yeah. So I mean, like I think that's really important, and it's one of the things that I've run into. I mean, I know that we keep bringing up Tony, but it's because Tony is like brilliant and knows so much, and helped me like more times than not on like technical stuff. But if there is something that like I'm going through it and I map it and like I give a reason for like why I mapped it to XYZ technique, Tony might be looking through it and he might be like, hey, like why do you think that this is that? And like I give my explanation, and then that could spark a whole other discussion of like, well, you're sort of like misunderstanding what's happening there, right? Or like what's happening in that execution right at that point in time. So that can change your whole perspective on like what that technique actually does and like how it executes and how it flows right in this whole chain. So yeah, I think it's super important. I love having collaborative docs like this because it makes it, when you are tearing something apart like we're doing, it makes it easier if you're not, especially in like a remote world, right? When we're not in the same room and like being able to draw on a whiteboard, it just makes it like 10 times easier. So
you brought up an interesting kind of like two points. One being that within a step, you can have multiple techniques or even sub techniques within there that can result in potentially their own analytics by themselves, which are really interesting. So like to your point, really reading it line by line, even though like Mike likes the smash and grab of give me the thing and I'll go do the other thing. Like there's merits to both of them, right? There's the quick win aspects, but then there's the long game of like, okay, let me validate this in some capacity. But the other point, which was the great debate of, okay, which technique is this actually mapped to? Because I think sometimes it could be this, or no, it could be that. But I think sometimes it could also be, well, it's both.
Mm-hmm.
So then are there capabilities of having tests to validate that it's both, or your capability to do both, even though it may result in the same thing? Right, like service creation, that probably fits into like 4 overlaying tactics: lateral movement, privilege escalation, persistence, some other thing I totally forgot about. But like there's 3 right now, but it's the context of what actually happens. And sometimes it could be all 3 in the same go, but the test is still the same, right? If I create a service, can I detect it? Can I identify it? Regardless of what the context is in that particular case, the test is still the same.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I think those are sort of like the nuances that come up with something like this, right? So like you brought up a really good point that I hadn't mentioned, was for the so for techniques that fall within multiple tactic categories. Typically, I think this is like the recommended way to do it. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know. This is how I do it. I try to think of like, what is the motivation behind why that technique is firing, right? So like if I do have to map it to a tactic level, you don't always have to do that. And like kind of to your point, it's not always important, because it's like, okay, the outcome's the same. So why do I care if it's execution or persistence? So like using your scheduled task example, or the one that we were talking about earlier, scheduled task, I'm fairly certain, falls underneath execution and persistence. Because, I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Scheduled task is there to persist on a system, but in order to do that, it has to execute, right? It needs to execute something. So it falls underneath that execution tactic as well. So that'd be one of them where it's like, okay, I think this is both, right? I think it is both execution and persistence. There's not just one clear-cut way of, kind of like slivering this out. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because the scheduled task, whether or not I want to see when it gets set, or whether or not I want to see when it gets executed, right? Those are two different tactics, tactics technically. But they might be 2 completely different ways to detect and, sort of like analyze that. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good point that you brought up.
Yeah, I think a lot of times there's sometimes the great debate of like, where does this exist? And, where do I rack and stack it in comparison to some other piece in this whole process, right? Like, do I necessarily care? Like, looking at step 8, there's a lot of things that have to occur before that person gets to step 8. So,
Yep.
In listening to Defensive Thursday with the Recon InfoSec crew, like there's a really good discussion of like, how far left do I want to focus, right? Because if I focus really far left and I get really good at containing and mitigating and preventing the left side of the attack matrix, then I don't necessarily, not that I don't focus on it, but because there has to be things that occur before we get to lateral movement, before we get to impact, right? Before I forgot what the term was. It was pretty funny. I'll have to go back and find out. Which was like before boom, right? Like, more I can get to that and prevent the boom.
I was waiting for you to say that.
The boom, yes.
Left the boom.
Left of the boom, yes. Thank you.
Yeah,
left of the boom.
It is a solid point, because like, I mean, years ago we had Proofpoint, and Proofpoint was like, oh, we can tell you that there's a JS file in the zip. Do you want to prevent JS files coming inbound? We're like, yeah, sure. And it's like, here we are, 2023, or
but
like
also
2022.
The context of that matters, though. If you look at step 1, it wasn't through email. It was
that's a solid point.
So
it led me to
now you have a different problem on your hands.
Yep.
Yes, at my gateway, can I inspect using something like a bin explode? I'm going to plug Sublime Security real quick, which does some really interesting use cases for detecting threats within email, BC things. They have the ability to explode out even potentially password protected ones to kind of look for those. So if I'm covered at that layer, now I have a new problem, which is, in this case, I go to a compromised website, download a malicious zip file. Like, that vector is now different. And again, would I like it in the email? Yeah, because that's a lot easier to deal with than, hey, how do I detect anytime a user goes to a malicious site that I may not know is malicious at the time and downloads what I may or may not realize at that time is a malicious zip file, unless something like AV already knows. But if it's, hot off the press. It's 8 a.m. Monday morning. Everything's ripping, and it takes time for that historical aspect for like AV and other things to pick up on it. If it's looking at like the IOC standpoint versus the behavioral standpoint.
Totally.
But things like, now I opened a zip folder and executed JavaScript. Okay, that kind of lineage is really interesting, right? Like, and then again, depending on like default programs, right? If we rely on Windows to be the default thing to open zip files versus like a 7-zip, I have to account for that as well in certain cases.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting you mentioned the lineage aspect of it. So again, coming from, or just throughout my experience, I never had like hands-on kind of like EDR telemetry type experience until I got to Red Canary, right? So like, I think that is, whether you're a sysadmin or whether you're whatever you're doing throughout your career, if you're wanting to be like a CTI analyst or do that, kind of like level of work, I think it is incredibly beneficial to get a view of what things look like executing on a box, regardless of if it's malicious or not. Because I think you both will attest to this, that a lot of like really benign things look suspicious as hell on an execution from an EDR perspective. And it could be completely legitimate. It could be signed by Microsoft. It could be like totally like legit, but it looks weird as hell. And you're like, wow, that's how that takes place. Okay, interesting.
Even Microsoft products themselves, not even talking about third-party things that occur. Chinese tax software. It's not bad in there today, but like just by itself, 7-zip, things like that, super sketchy. Just the way that you're looking at it, like, why would I ever do that?
Right.
We could
my favorite
whole episode just on that.
Yeah, I know. Good sidebar, because my favorite was always Broadcom. Their drivers would always have different company names. Some would have a period and some wouldn't, and some would be like just. Yeah, it's absolutely chaos. Like,
just like wrecks your detection rules.
Yeah,
there was
you don't know which is like legit or not. Right?
Right.
Like, it's just horrible.
We were told one time to allow list all of app data local, because this piece of software would spin up, write a unique folder name. It was basically like a GUID generated. It was never had the same structure to it, and then would have like different things written inside of it. And then as the application closed, it would close and basically like clean up after itself. And they're like, well, at the time, the EDR was just flagging it every single time. And then the way that it would execute things, so there was like 10 alerts every time the program started across like 20 systems. It just became a nuisance. They're like, yeah, just allow this, app data local, just the whole thing. It's fine, because we don't know where it's going to drop it. It could be in a subfolder within that. It could be in its own. They had no idea. They're just basically like throwing it at the wall and seeing what's stuck. And it was absolutely mind blowing, just the way like some of these are written. But
yeah, I think that's it. It gives you a new appreciation for like how hard detection engineering is, or how hard threat hunting is, right? Because it's like, again, coming from like let's just say like an academic perspective, or even just a non-technical practitioner level, engineer I guess level, you just might be thinking like, oh, that should be easy to detect, or like that should be easy enough to like figure out and like track that lineage or whatever. It's like, well, a lot of times it's not. there have been so many detection rules that like I would have suggested or whatever, and literally it happened. I would think it looks so suspicious, and I'm like, why would you ever do this? And then, honestly, it'd be Tony half the time. Tony would be like, yeah, no, that's like totally legit. Like that happens all the time. And I'm like, oh, well, crap. Well, I can't do that then. So yeah. So
where's Tony?
I know. You get Tony on. I want to, because I know we're already like over an hour. Y'all tell me, do you think that we have a pretty good feeling for like how to go through and like map a report? There's one other thing that I wanted to touch on after that.
Yeah, I feel like it's a good starting point of like realizing that there's caveats, and not every report, even from the same vendor, is structured the same way. So it's important to be able to have like those pieces of information of like things to look at as I'm reading it. How should I break it out? Like, how you do it is how I would approach it is probably slightly different. Like I'd probably have like a GDoc up and just start like dropping like, okay, I know this is an atomic. I know that's a potential thing. Like I don't remember what the explicit thing is, but I know it exists and I'll go find it later.
Yeah.
And it's really just how you operate. But I think there's a lot of good content of like approachability to this, which we'll dive into a little bit more next week. But curious still like what the one last thing you want to jump into was.
Yeah, I mean, just the one final thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, and it won't take very long, is just like, okay, you've done all this mapping, right? Like this is all done. Let's say you've mapped the report, great. You've done your analysis, you've had your conversations, whatever. That's all great. Let's say that, I think this is probably common. Let's say that communication at your org is not stellar, right? So like you're basically kind of doing this in a bubble, and then you're going to pass off your analysis to somebody else, and they're going to do whatever they do in a bubble. So I think that's fairly common. It's neither good nor bad, but it just happens. So you need a way to like present the information, right? You need a way to like combine everything together, because maybe somebody's not going to read through all of your notes on that Google Doc or read through your various scribbles of, information. So I think at the end, like once you've mapped everything, once all that's done, I think, and this is where I'm going to kind of eat my words a little bit from earlier, I think having something like a table is actually good, right? Because you need something. You need something that gives a snapshot of what happened, right? Of what your analysis is saying, whether or not that's another, like short, very short, like paragraph or 2 paragraphs of like, here's what happened and here's what we think you should focus on. Here's a table of like those techniques, and like give as much context as you can in the procedures at the end. The other thing that I sent y'all the link earlier. So Tidal Cyber has come out with kind of like their community edition. It's basically like a very nice and easy way to have a attack navigator layer. I always found attack navigator to be a little bit obtuse, I guess is a way to put it. It's a little bit hard to kind of like get a grasp on it. It's a little bit old, and it's fine. It has done well over the years. But I think Tidal Cyber's community edition kind of does that really well. Yeah, perfect. So you get this like really nice like web interface of like just being able to have your attack techniques, and you can do all the same things that you can do in Navigator in this. So like, yeah, you pull this up. It has this is not a plug for them. I just like really like the way that this works. It has the different data sources. It has the campaigns. It has references, analytics. Like it has all that really good meaty stuff that you'd want per technique. But then it also gives you that like a snapshot view of like what happened. Give me a one shot view of all the techniques that might be important. So like if you go back to that, yeah, I don't know how you do that. However you get back to, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Same.
In some way, yeah. You can like mark this up, right? So like you can like highlight the specific techniques that you want, and then you can like hide all the ones that aren't marked up, so that you have like just a snapshot sort of heat map type view of, and yeah, actually it has the Atomic Red Team stuff in here as well, which is really nice.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah, so I really like using this for anything that I'm doing, really. I mean, I always like, I'm a very visual person, like just in general. So like having something that will just give me an upfront snapshot of either what I'm reading or like what I'm going to do next with something, like having this just like right there is really nice. So I think this is a good tool to use, especially for CTI analysts. It's relatively new. Like I think they just started up in January of last year, I think. So, and it's like ex-MITRE people. And so like, I know those people over there. So it's a good product, and they're like working on some really cool stuff. So I think give it a try, give it a look. And there's always like Attack Navigator if you just don't like it. But I think this is like a much better interface for like interacting with that kind of data.
Yeah, I really like the aspect of not just here's the technique and here's some references, but here's tests from various sources, but also here's detection or analytics from various sources that you can apply. Like I think that's really
That's
important to have, because it simplifies that process of, okay, now what do I do? Like, okay, I can click this, I can get linked to potential ways I can put this into whether it's my own custom sim or some other thing, or using something like a Sigma where I can just pipe it in, spit it out into my specific usage, and then run test, validate analytic, and go through it. So I think that's kind of like lowers the barrier of, okay, now what? Like I did the CTI part, now how do I like go test it, and then how do I then at some point to make sure I have the detection.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of why I wanted to bring it up, because I think that this kind of a tool is extremely good or helpful for this kind of an exercise, right? So for like a purple team, right? So you've got your multiple sort of personas, right? So you've got CTI analyst, you've got threat hunter, you've even got detection engineer, you've got you've got those kind of different personas that can all look at the same kind of thing and be able to get what they need out of it, right? So like as a CTI analyst, maybe I'm just concerned with looking at and mapping, like those different tactics and techniques, right? So like maybe this is the view that I'm most concerned with. But as a detection engineer, maybe you're like, all right, I want to dive in and see what atomic test can I run for the thing that you highlighted, right? So like there's obviously a very easy way to do that here. So like you say, it just gives you that like really nice way to go from, okay, I did analysis. Now what do I do? Here's how I can do it, and then go do it. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that, kind of put that in there at the end, because I think
that's cool. Yeah, that's pretty neat. Like, and I assume like you're able to share this across the team and like save the matrix on the site. And
Yep. You can save it on the site. You can share it with your team. I think you can even make it like public, so like you could share a public one out. So that actually might be a good thing at the end of this, is to like, if you put one together, or I can help out with that. Putting one together and then sharing that out publicly to go along with this. So it might be kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great idea.
Love it. More things to add to our references for the end of it. I mean, the slides are probably useless at that point, because they're mostly just images of Goots.
I mean, those are essential.
Yeah. You go back to the first one. If you have a copy of that, you're probably opening yourself up to a lawsuit as well. It's probably a good idea.
Yeah, don't download anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Just review the video. No, so this is super fun and very informative. Again, like different perspectives of approaching it, right? Mike's approach of smash and grab versus Harrison's I'm going to read every single word and every single line and go find those abstract things. Well, I'm just like, yeah, all right, that's cool. It's Gootloader. I'm just going to go find something else that's a little more. I got bored and read the title, and I'm moving on now. Because I think it's good to be able to, even if it's not your wheelhouse, like to have some form of ability to abstract out of that and apply it to wherever you sit. Because I think it's important to have kind of that background across the spectrum to really just make yourself a little more effective of wherever you sit in the security practitioner standpoint. So
yeah, I once asked, I think I asked Katie Nichols, and I was like, hey, do you, it was on a report or something. I was like, do you actually like read the report? And she's like, yeah, I read it. I'm like, okay. This is like, I'm like zipping through and ripping stuff. And
like, I mean, F, look for keywords and.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think like that is, not to go off on a totally separate tangent, but I think that is sort of a slight failure of the CTI industry, in that there's a lot of blogs, a lot of products that get put out that try to serve too many personas, like a detection engineer or a CTI analyst or a threat hunter, and it doesn't do well at any of them. Like there's obviously the off cases, like the Mandiant blog can pretty much serve pretty much anybody. But I think a lot of the time, some of the time at least, there's some reports that come out that it's just like, all right, who is this for, right? And like, who is supposed to take something away from this? And I think like, as a CTI analyst and as somebody who's written reports, written blogs for years now, that is one of the things that I always start with and I think as a reader you should start with as well, of who is the audience for this, right? So like if we pulled up a blog like a Gootloader blog that was more targeted for, I mean this wouldn't happen, but for like a C-level, right? Or for an executive, right?
It wouldn't happen.
You're not going to want to include stuff like the infection chain and like the YAR rules and like stuff like that. You're not going to want that. But
That's
like
the
as a
TLDR.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And I think like too many times there's too many things that kind of you try to package it all into like one thing because like you want to have just one single product, but really it'd be nice to like be able to split it out. And I understand all the how hard that is because nobody has the time to like really dig into that. But I think it'd be really helpful to kind of like expand on that. So that's my one little dig at the industry. But yeah.
Harrison's over here being all methodical about like who he's targeting his blog post for, and I'm over here with like a Pepe Sylvia, like I don't care who you are, like come read this, like this is gonna be awesome, like let's go.
Yeah.
And then there's everybody in between that writes like good stuff.
Yeah. So
right on. No.
Yeah.
Thanks again for jamming. This is super cool. So we'll be taking the ideas here and abstracting them out, kind of stepping through, and then next week. Got Anton coming back to help us then figure out like what are some relevant tests, some caveats with testing, getting his perspective, insights, and kind of approaching this idea of like, well, we read this report, we have these ideas for tests, like what are some of the gotchas, the do's or do nots. So it's gonna be super fun. And then after we do all the tests, we got to figure out like, do we have the right data to detect it based on the tests we ran? Did we have the right data sources and analytics? So Nazir Dean's going to be joining us again from the detection engineering and kind of like data source analysis standpoint. So I think it's going to be awesome to kind of keep feeding these and figure out like how do we then after we run the test validate we have all things. So looking forward to the next couple weeks, yeah, don't forget the Goots. Here's our references.
Always use Goots wherever you can. I mean, like that's really the key takeaway here.
Please make sure you tweet out a high def version of the Goots for everybody to use in their own blogs and reports and executive briefings, because
I don't know. I feel like honestly, I feel like it gets better the less quality image that it is.
So like just start screenshotting it like 5 times over. That way, like it's really pixelated. Yeah,
exactly.
That's a good idea.
Pixelated fat goose, and then
Yo,
so
like an 8-bit or a 16-bit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That is all right. Googling for it.
Don't worry, Mike's got this.
Mike's on it.
It'll be ready in about 2 minutes. So we'll wrap up and just go on Twitter. It'll be available.
Cool beans. Well, no, I mean, I had a good time. This is great. Continue doing what you're doing. I like this series a lot. So yeah, I'll definitely be watching. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back on at some point.
For sure.
Blast. Awesome. All right, y'all. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Next week. Toodles, y'all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have fun. Bye.
I don't know where